Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about part 5 of An Inspector Calls Sybil Birling's Interrogation. Now you need to have read, watched or studied the play, and you should be using this video for revision purposes or to gain a deeper understanding of what happens in this section of the play. As per usual, I'll start by summarising what happens in this section of the play. We'll look at the key character, themes, context and quotes from this section that you may want to memorise for your exam, and I'll leave you with an exam style question if you want to practice some analytical writing. So, first of all, the plot of part 5, Sybil Birling's Interrogation. Remember the play is in 3 acts. I'm just subdividing it into further parts. Sybil Birling's Interrogation I'm going to take from the stage direction. He goes out, they watch him go in silence, we hear the front door slam, all the way to where it says end of Act 2. So what happens in this section? Well, Inspector Gould shows Sybil Birling, also known as Mrs. Birling, a photograph of Eva Smith. Initially, Sybil pretends to not recognise the photograph, but eventually she's forced to admit that she does recognise Eva Smith. The audience learns that Mrs. Birling is a member of the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation. It's a charitable group that's meant to help the women of Bromley. Mrs. Birling reveals that Eva Smith has approached her charity under the name Mrs. Birling, and this prejudiced Sybil against Eva. Now, I've put charity in quote marks because I don't really think that the charity Mrs. Birling runs is particularly charitable. Some charities in the Edwardian era were run by the upper classes, sometimes women, and they were more of a front to make themselves look good, to make themselves look as though they were helping the classes below them, whereas in reality the amount of help offered was minimal, if anything at all. Mrs. Birling is in quote marks because this is the name that Eva Smith used to refer to herself. And Mrs. Birling, as in Sybil Birling, took offence to this, that Eva, a girl of that class, a working class girl, would dare use her upper class name. As a result, Mrs. Birling used her influence as a chair of the committee to ensure that Eva Smith received no help from the so-called charity. The audience learns that Sybil Birling takes no responsibility for how she treated Eva Smith, despite realising the end that Eva Smith met, which was committing suicide through the drinking of disinfectant and a slow, painful death. Sybil Birling takes no responsibility, and instead she thinks she did her duty. She listened to Eva Smith's case and she decided, based on her prejudice, her classism, that she wasn't going to help Eva Smith, and she thought this was okay, this was her duty. In this section we really see Mrs. Birling show her classism, so that's when you have class prejudice, you dislike people from other classes. In this case it's Mrs. Birling, who is upper class, disliking Eva Smith, who is working class. And we really see her cold nature. She's described as cold in the opening stage directions, and we really see this cold nature come to light here. Eva Smith has committed suicide. There was a baby inside her, so an innocent unborn baby is dead as well, and Mrs. Birling shows no remorse. She thinks she did her duty. Without realising that she's digging a grave, to use a metaphor, for her son Eric, Mrs. Birling advises Inspector Gould to publicly shame the man who got Eva Smith pregnant. Now, by this stage of the play, the audience is probably guessing that it's Eric, and as a student who's already read An Inspector Calls, I'm sure you know this is the case. The audience learns that Eva Smith appealed to Mrs. Birling's charity because she refused to accept the stolen money that the father, who we know is Eric, was providing her with. This really shows that Eva Smith has morality. She has a sense of right and wrong. She will not accept stolen money even though she desperately needed it to survive. Finally, Mrs. Birling understands what the audience has suspected for a while, and that Eric is actually the father of Eva Smith's baby. We get some clues that he was young, and he was drunk, and he was of a different class to Eva Smith. And all of these clues would have informed the audience that Eric was the perpetrator here, and finally the penny has dropped for Mrs. Birling. And the real horror of it all is in rejecting to help Eva Smith. Sybil Birling has inadvertently killed her own grandchild, because if Eric fathered that baby, it would have been Sybil Birling's grandchild. This section ends, and actually Act 2 ends, with Eric entering the stage looking sort of pale and ashen, and the curtains fall. Now remember, when you analyse a play, you can always analyse dramatic entrances and exits, and this is a very dramatic entrance from Eric, and then Priestley decides to end the act here, which would only just increase tension in the interval. The audience be talking about what happens next, how would the play end. It's very clever stagecraft from J.B. Priestley. Okay, this section is obviously all about Sybil Birling. So what do we learn about her? Well, in part 1, Sheila and Gerald's engagement, that's what I've called part 1, we learn that she's presented as upper class and she's presented as cold. We get this from the stage directions that Priestley provides us with right at the start of the play. In part 5, Sybil's interrogation, we learn that she's exactly the same. She's upper class and she's cold. But not only is she upper class, she's classist. She is prejudiced against other classes, particularly the working class, particularly Eva Smith. And we really see her cold characteristics when we learn that basically she's killed her own grandchild, and prior to discovering Eric's involvement, she was completely cold and heartless to the fact that a young woman, a young mother, and an innocent an innocent child has been killed. I think J.B. Priestley presents Sybil Birling as detestable, someone to hate. From the way she tries to use her social superiority to intimidate Inspector Goole, to the way she judges the working class when she judges Eva Smith, from the way she shifts blame of responsibility for Eva Smith's death onto her husband, her daughter, and the father, before even beginning to accept any responsibility herself, to the way she rejects Eva Smith just for using her name. There must be thousands of Birlings in the world, and she thought her name was untouchable, that it shouldn't be used by someone of working class. The sheer arrogance to even have that kind of thought. I think J.B. Priestley wants the audience to really hate Sybil Birling. Now, Sybil is symbolic, and she represents the upper classes. So I think here Priestley is trying to get his audience to realise that the upper classes might be cold, like Sybil is, might be classist like Sybil is, might not offer help like Sybil doesn't offer help, might pretend to offer help by running charities, but these charities really don't make any meaningful difference. And I think J.B. Priestley is trying to shed a spotlight on the upper classes, and maybe encourage society to really analyse them through a lens and see where change is needed in post-war Britain, and where the classes should become less distinguished and merge together to create a more equal post-war British society. Okay, what theme can we explore here? Well, in previous videos we've looked at class, responsibility, older versus younger generation, exploitation. I think it's about time we came onto the theme of gender. And in this particular play, women is a good place to focus our attention. So when Priestley wrote An Inspector Calls in 1945, the role of women in society was more advanced than when the play is set in 1912. When we refer to 1945, we can refer to it as post-war Britain, and when we refer to 1912, we should refer to it as the Edwardian era. Despite being Mr. Birling's social superior, and we learn this from the opening stage directions, Mrs. Birling is his subordinate. She acts subservient. She's very obedient to him. She refers to herself in relation to her husband, and she leaves a lot of the decision making up to him. And this actually reflects society's impression and roles for women. Despite coming from money and coming from social power, she is passive when it comes to her relationship with her husband and lets her husband dominate and be the patriarchal power. And this was quite common in British homes in 1912 in the Edwardian era and in 1945, although to a lesser extent, because after World War I and World War II, society, and particularly the men in society, were beginning to see just how valuable women were. So when the men were off to war fighting, the women were filling in those roles back home and doing a very good job of it. So that when the men returned, there was a slight shift in attitude. And there was a tension here. Some parts of British society were very pro women's rights and women coming out of the private sphere into what you might call the public sphere and taking on more social roles and responsibilities. But the other half of society was very much against it and preferred a traditional and conservative view that women's roles in society was predominantly to do with being a wife, having children, raising children, looking after the household environment. So there was a tension going on there. And Mrs. Birling actually supports that traditional conservative view that men should be patriarchal and be more powerful and more influential than the women in their lives. And I think this is something J.B. Priestley is trying to challenge. As a result of maybe having to be subservient to Mr. Birling, I think Mrs. Birling takes out her frustration on other women. She can't take out her frustration on men because, remember, with the gender roles, men had more power than women. So Mrs. Birling targets her frustration on women that she thinks are inferior to her, either based on class, so she takes out her frustration on Eva Smith with the way she treats her, or based on age, and she takes out her frustration on Sheila, calling her hysterical amongst other labels. When talking about women in this play, I think it's really interesting to mention Eva Smith, and that she is the complete opposite to Mrs. Birling. Where Mrs. Birling is upper class, Eva Smith is working class. Where Mrs. Birling is quite subservient and listens and is quite passive to Mr. Birling, Eva Smith is the opposite. She starts a strike that demands a fair wage. Where Mrs. Birling was willing to be morally questionable and lie about the fact she didn't know Eva Smith and didn't recognise the photograph, Eva Smith is very honest and morally righteous. She wouldn't accept stolen money from Eric. So if you are going to talk about women in the play, you may want to contrast Mrs. Birling and Eva Smith. If you want to get really deep into it and really technical, you might look at Sheila as maybe sort of a bridge between Mrs. Birling and Eva Smith. She sort of transitions from being that passive, traditional, conservative woman at the start of the play who's going to marry Gerald and is going to listen to her father, and she becomes more of an outspoken, socialist, morally right, almost Eva Smith-like character / the inspector-like character by the end of the play. So she undergoes a real womanly transformation, and that might be reflective of what I'll be talking about in the next section, which is the context. And whilst we're on the topic and the theme of women, contextually it's worth you knowing about the women's suffrage movement. So the suffrage movement was an early 19th century movement that demanded that women have the right to vote in Britain. Marches were organised, protests and riots, and they became increasingly violent actually. And many women were arrested for being a part of this movement. And the reason they were arrested and the reason that marches and protests and riots were used is that this movement was met with resistance, predominantly by men, but sometimes by women also, who were against the idea that their fellow women should have more rights and more influence in society. But due to the persistence of the women involved in the suffrage movement, by 1912 some women were allowed to vote. This were mainly women of a certain age and women who had property. And then a bit later in 1928, with consistent pressure, the government eventually gave women the same voting rights as men. And so the women's suffrage movement was successful in achieving their aim. and then sort of continued to develop to get equality for women across many aspects of society. A couple of things worth pointing out. I think World War I and World War II helped women's suffrage because it was a great way for women to show their value to society. When all the men were out fighting the war, the women stepped up and fulfilled those roles left by the men in society, so that when the men came back from war, they realised that women, shouldn't just be kept at home as wives and mothers and people to look after households, that they had an important role to play in society, both in terms of ideas they could contribute or physical help they could provide. So I think this helped the suffragette and the suffrage movement, And what I also want to flag up to you is that J.B. Priestley was a feminist. He believed in empowering women, and he believed in his ideal post-war Britain, that it was a Britain without classism and sort of without sexism, and that men and women were treated equally and people of all classes were treated equally. So, what are the key quotes from this section, Sybil Birling's interrogation? Well, Inspector Gould says, "Public men, Mr. Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges." That key word, responsibilities, which we know is a theme, is there. And here Inspector Gould is sort of telling off Mr. Birling. Yes, you have power and influence, but you also have a responsibility with this power and influence to help those less powerful and less fortunate than you. And this is a warning to the audience too. Mrs. Birling, you're a prominent member of the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation, aren't you? Inspector Gould asks this interrogative question. I include it here because it gives you the name of the charity, Bromley Women's Charity Organisation. Mrs. Birling explains why she was prejudiced to Eva Smith. She said first she called herself Mrs. Birling, and here you'd have to explain the significance of Eva Smith using that name. You might want to talk about Eric Birling being the father, and actually if they were able to get married, which we know they weren't because he was upper class and she was working class, and that would have been frowned upon by society at the time. Her name would have actually been Mrs. Birling anyway, so there's elements of truth to it. But then you have to look at Mrs. Birling, as in Sybil Birling, taking offence to that. She uses words like, it was a gross impertinence, it was rude. I think she only had herself to blame. Mrs. Birling here is talking about Eva Smith, and she blames Eva Smith for her own suicide, which I guess is true in the sense that she would have put the bottle of disinfectant to her mouth, but I think it's incredibly harsh when you consider Mr. Birling kicked her out of a job. Sheila Birling kicked her out of a job. Gerald took her on as a mistress and dumped her. Mrs. Birling herself refused her help. I think that's a really harsh and cold attitude that Mrs. Birling has. I did nothing I'm ashamed of. I consider I did my duty. Here the square brackets and the ellipsis indicate that I'm taking sections of a longer quote. And here I'd look at that phrase, nothing I'm ashamed of. She doesn't seem to feel any shame that her actions have killed a woman and that woman's baby. What kind of heartlessness and cold nature do you need to not at least be a bit embarrassed that your actions have led to someone committing suicide? I consider I did my duty. This abstract noun duty is really interesting. Duty is a moral obligation to do something. So as a teacher, I have a duty to teach my students to the best I can. As a pastor, you might have a duty to look after the people in your church. As a judge, you have a duty to come to a fair verdict about the trial. So she considers her duty as a charity organisation. She considers she did her duty by not giving charity to Eva Smith, which is ridiculous because the whole point of a charity is to give charity. So really she didn't do her duty, but she's sort of deluding herself to think she did do her duty, if that makes sense. Sheila says, no, oh horrible, horrible. This is when Inspector Gould explains that Eva Smith was pregnant. This reaction here, the use of exclamatives and the repetition of horrible, and the interjection "oh" shows that Sheila has emotions, And you can contrast this with Sybil Birling, who has no reaction to this news. Instead, actually, she tries to shirk responsibility. She tries to pass responsibility off to other people. Mrs. Birling says, "Go look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility." Again, we have that keyword responsibility, which we know is a theme. And here you could look at the imperative. She tells Inspector Gould what to do. Go look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility. Mrs. Birling is amazing at not taking any blame for herself. Now remember, she symbolises the upper class. So what we learn here is the upper classes never accept responsibility for the state of the country. They have enough money to help the working class, but they don't accept responsibility. Instead, it's easier for them to blame other people in society. That's what I think J.B. Priestley is trying to teach us here through Mrs. Birling. She was alone. She was here alone, friendless, almost penniless. Here Inspector Gould uses a triple, 3 ways to describe Eva Smith: alone, friendless, almost penniless. And this emotive language really builds up what you might call pathos, like an emotional connection with Eva Smith. The audience is meant to sympathise with her, and as a result hate Mrs. Birling all the more for how she just disregarded her and didn't offer any help. Mother, I think it was cruel and vile. Here Sheila's talking about her mother, Sybil Birling, and how she thought it was cruel and vile that she didn't help Eva Smith. And I think Sheila is voicing the opinion of the audience, because as a reader, I know for sure I think Sybil is cruel and vile, and I'm 99% sure most of the post-war British audience watching the play would also agree that Sybil is a cruel and vile character. So here we got the adjectives cruel and vile that you could analyse. Mrs. Birling says some horrible classist stuff, simply absurd in a girl in her position. So the phrase a bit earlier in the quote was that she had elaborate feelings and fine scruples. So the idea that she could fall in love or have sort of complex thoughts is simply absurd in a working class girl. Basically, Mrs. Birling is kind of saying that working class women aren't intelligent enough to have elaborate feelings like falling in love, which is just a stupid and ridiculous thing to say, really, and sort of makes me want to give Mrs. Birling a metaphorical slap. This is another phrase that I would love to metaphorically slap Mrs. Birling for saying: as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. Sorry, there's a typo there, ever, not every. A girl of that sort. Here you could look at the word sort and you could link that to working class. So as if a working class girl would ever refuse money. Mrs. Birling is so downgrading of the working class that she thinks they would do anything for money. But actually what we learn from Eva Smith is that she's so morally righteous, she refuses stolen money even at the expense of her own life. So ironically, you could argue, a working class woman is more morally righteous than the upper class woman, Mrs. Birling. But I accept no blame for it at all. Mrs. Birling says this, and this is a good quote to use, particularly if you talk about the older and younger generation, because Mr. Birling says something similar: I accept no responsibility for it, whereas Sheila and Eric do accept responsibility for how they treated Eva Smith. Mother, stop, stop. Here Sheila is trying to stop her mother from condemning Eric even more. Sheila is almost like the eyes and ears of the audience and the voice of the audience, and she's expressing what the audience already suspects, that Eric is the father of Eva Smith's baby. So you could look at the exclamative, you could look at the repetition of stop. This shows that Sheila's sort of enlightened to the situation, whereas Mrs. Birling isn't. She's trapped in her coldness, her classism. You're behaving like a hysterical child tonight. Mrs. Birling says this to Sheila. Remember when I told you about Mrs. Birling being subservient to Mr. Birling and taking out her anger on the working class? We saw that with the way she called Eva Smith girls of that sort. We now have her taking out her frustration on her daughter who's younger than her. You're behaving like a hysterical child tonight. I don't know if you know this, but hysterical used to actually be a medical term that doctors used, and it was to refer to a woman who was so emotionally anxious that she caused stress in people around her. It's since been removed. It's no longer a medical term. But by calling Sheila hysterical, Mrs. Birling is basically saying that her daughter has no control over herself. Whereas in reality, I think the audience might agree that it's Mrs. Birling who hasn't, you could argue, too much control over herself, a certain heartlessness for not helping Eva Smith. I shall do my duty. Inspector Gould says this. I really love it when Inspector Gould throws back words that characters have said back at them. So Mrs. Birling says, "I consider I did my duty," and and Inspector Gould now goes, "I shall do my duty." So I love that when the inspector repeats what the other characters say back to them. Finally, there's the stage direction. Eric enters looking extremely pale and distressed. You could zoom in on the adjectives pale and distressed, and why he's pale, why is he distressed, what are the connotations, what have we learnt as an audience. And you may want to talk about entrances and exits, because this is a very dramatic place to end Act 2. So, what can you do? You can make notes from this video on a physical copy of the play. You could also try answering the question, how does Priestley want his post-war British audience to react to Mrs. Birling in An Inspector Calls? You might want to introduce Mrs. Birling, and that she represents the upper classes, and that she's presented as cold and classist. In your body paragraphs, you may want to pick out some of the quotes from earlier in the video to analyse and explore what Mrs. Birling does in An Inspector Calls. And throughout, you want to keep linking it back to Priestley's intentions, remembering he believed in getting rid of the class system, he believed in gender equality. How could you link Mrs. Birling's portrayal to those ideas? And finally, draw out any conclusions. How do you think Priestley would want his post-war British audience to react to the character of Mrs. Birling in An Inspector Calls? If you found this video useful, please give it a like, and please consider subscribing for the rest of my An Inspector Calls analytical videos, and feel free to leave a comment if you think I've missed anything out. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.